At 8:17 a.m., they slid a document across a glass table like it was a napkin. A single page. One signature line. And one sentence that would have turned my name into their shield. Standard compliance attestation. That's what the head of legal called it. Calm voice. Perfect tie. A smile trained to look like empathy. But I'd read it 3 times before the coffee even cooled. It wasn't an attestation. It was an alibi. The room smelled like cedar and expensive cologne, the kind that clings to your skin long after you leave. Outside, Chicago looked clean from 40 floors up, all glass, all steel, all confidence. Inside that boardroom, the truth was smaller. A single pen, a single signature, and a plan that required my silence. "Claire," the CFO said, leaning back like he owned the air. "This is routine." Routine. That word is a soft pillow over hard intent. Routine is how they ask you to lie without saying the word lie. I looked at the document again. It referenced quarterly customer verification improvements. The phrase sounded harmless. It was not. It was a mask over a decision made months ago. A decision to stop checking certain accounts because it slowed growth. A decision to let risk enter the building in a suit and call it revenue. I had proof. Not suspicion. Not theory. Proof. An internal dashboard. A hidden filter. A temporary setting that had been temporary for 91 days. When I found it, my stomach didn't drop. My stomach went quiet. Like my body already knew what my mind was still refusing to accept. I wasn't being invited into the future. I was being used to protect it. The CFO tapped the pen against the table. Tap, tap, tap. Each tap said the same thing. Be smart, be cooperative, be easy. The head of legal watched me like a person watching a safe, wondering if it would open. And then my manager of 2 years, the one who had once praised my integrity in front of the entire department, cleared his throat. "Claire, I need you to understand," he said carefully. "This is about alignment." Alignment. Another soft word. A word they use when they want you to lean in the same direction as the lie. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the document. I didn't perform anger. Because anger is what they expect from a woman when they want to label her unstable. I just asked one question. Who wrote this? The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was strategic. The CFO smiled, slightly wider. "We're all on the same team." Then he said the line that told me everything. "Sign it now. We're closing the acquisition window." Acquisition. So that was it. Arbor and Vale wasn't building a product anymore. It was packaging a story. And I was the last stubborn detail that didn't fit the narrative. I held the pen. Felt the weight of it. The way it was heavier than it needed to be. Like it wanted to feel important. I imagined my signature on that page. My name would be printed under theirs, like an endorsement. Like consent. Like confession. And a month later, when the regulators came because they always come, eventually they would point to my signature and say, "She knew. She approved. She was part of it." They would not say, "She was pressured. She was cornered. She was used." Companies don't say, "We used her." Companies say, "She signed." I set the pen down. Not dramatically. Just, down. And I said quietly, "No." One word. Small. Polite. And absolute. The CFO's smile didn't break, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Claire," he said, "don't do this. Don't do this." As if refusing to lie was the betrayal. As if their plan was a bridge, and my integrity was the fire. My manager leaned forward, his voice softening. "Claire, you're brilliant. But you're making this bigger than it is." I looked at him and realized something that felt colder than fear. He believed what he was saying, not because it was true, because believing it made him safe. When you're standing near a lie that big, you don't survive by fighting it. You survive by calling it normal. And then, like the room had rehearsed it, the head of legal spoke again. "If you can't sign," she said, "we'll have to consider whether you're still the right fit for this role." Fit. There it was. The corporate guillotine wrapped in velvet. They didn't threaten me with a firing. They threatened me with a story. The story of a difficult woman. A wretched woman. A woman who didn't understand business. A woman who couldn't adapt. I stood. I collected my notebook. And I walked out without raising my voice. because I'd learned something the hard way, in places like Arbor and Vale. If you scream, they call you emotional. If you stay silent, they call you complicit. So you do something else. You become precise. You become patient. You become inevitable. At 8:29 a.m., as the elevator doors closed, my phone buzzed. A calendar invite. Title: Transition Planning Compliance Leadership. Time: 2 p.m. Attendees: everyone who had just asked me to sign. And one name I didn't recognize. Interim Compliance Lead, TBD. TBD says, they were already replacing me. They weren't even hiding it. I stared at the invite until the screen dimmed. Then, I did the only thing that kept my hands steady. I opened a secure folder and looked at the timeline I'd been building for weeks. Screenshots, exports, email headers, everything time-stamped, everything clean, everything real. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning survival. But survival, in a place like this, always looks like revenge to the people who tried to erase you. At 5:42 p.m., HR called me into a small room with beige walls and a bowl of candy no one ever ate. They used the word restructuring. They used the phrase performance alignment. They used my own annual review, the one my manager wrote, and read it back to me like scripture. And then they said the line that almost made me laugh. We're offering you a generous severance if you sign today. Sign. Again. Always sign. That's how they build cages out of paper. I looked at the document. Non-disparagement. Non-disclosure. No contact with regulators. A muzzle. A clean one. I slid it back across the table. No, I said again. And HR blinked like I'd spoken in a language they didn't expect. Claire, the HR rep whispered. If you don't sign, this will be harder. Harder. For me. Not for them. For them, it would be easy. They would move on. They would replace my chair. They would remove my name from the org chart. They would tell the story that protected them. And then, 3 weeks later, something happened that no one in that building could have predicted. Their acquisition, the one they were racing toward, collapsed in a single morning. Not because of rumors, not because of leaks, because a regulator's email arrived in the CEO's inbox at 6:03 a.m. Subject line: Formal Inquiry Customer Verification Practices. And attached to that inquiry was a file. A file with my name, nowhere on it. A file with their names everywhere, because I'd built my evidence the way they built their lies. Quietly. Systematically. And impossible to deny. They tried to blame me. Of course they did. They sent messages. They called former coworkers. They floated the idea that I was vindictive. But the evidence didn't care about their adjectives. The evidence had dates. The evidence had logs. The evidence had their own language in their own threads. And when the board asked, how did we let this happen? No one said my name with confidence. Because to say my name was to admit something worse than a scandal. It was to admit they'd fired the one person who tried to stop it. I didn't destroy Arbor and Vale with rage. I didn't destroy it with gossip. I destroyed it with what they feared most. A clean truth. And the quiet woman they tried to erase became the reason their empire couldn't pretend anymore. 3 months before the boardroom pen, my life looked stable from the outside. Not happy. Stable. The kind of stable people compliment because it makes them feel safe about their own choices. I had a condo with windows that faced the lake. I had a job title that sounded expensive at dinner parties. Head of Compliance, at Arbor and Vale. A fintech company that liked to describe itself as a bridge between access and innovation. That phrase was printed on walls, mugs, and recruiting brochures. In the lobby, a neon sign glowed in white letters. Build trust at scale. I used to pause in front of it each morning. Not because it inspired me. Because it warned me. You don't write trust in neon unless you're trying to convince someone it exists. On my first day, the CEO shook my hand and said, "We move fast here, Claire." He said it with pride. Fast was their religion. Fast meant promotions. Fast meant headlines. Fast meant the kind of growth that makes investors lean forward. Fast also meant shortcuts. It always does. I didn't join Arbor and Vale because I loved risk. I joined because I believed in systems. I believed that if people wanted to build something real, they would also want to build it clean. And for a while, it looked clean. My team was small but sharp. My direct reports were the kind of professionals who still asked hard questions instead of trying to look smart. And my manager, Dan Mercer, seemed like the rare kind of leader who didn't treat compliance like a nuisance. He was charming in a quiet way. Not the loud confidence of sales, the smooth confidence of someone who understands power and doesn't need to prove he has it. In meetings, Dan would say things like, "We don't cut corners," and people would nod. Because when a man in a tailored suit says, "We don't cut corners," everyone wants to believe him. It makes them feel virtuous without having to change anything. The CFO, Grant Sloan, was different. Grant didn't speak in values. He spoke in outcomes. He had a voice that made every sentence sound like a decision already approved by the universe. He rarely looked at you while you spoke, not because he was rude, because he was busy calculating how useful your words were to him. During my second week, he stepped into my office without knocking. He glanced at the books on my shelf, regulatory manuals, auditing standards, risk frameworks. Then he smiled, like he'd found a childhood photo of someone trying too hard. "You're thorough," he said. I didn't know yet that this was not a compliment. At Arbor and Vale, thoroughness wasn't a skill. It was a threat. Grant sat down as if the chair belonged to him. He leaned in slightly. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice, as if the walls were sensitive. "Compliance here is collaborative." I waited. He smiled again. "You'll learn what matters." Then he left, and the air in my office felt different after he walked out, like it had been touched by something that didn't believe in rules. That night, I went home and opened my laptop again. Not because I had to. Because a part of me had started listening for footsteps behind the words. Collaborative. You'll learn what matters. People who speak like that aren't warning you about mistakes. They're warning you about boundaries. Over the next month, I noticed the pattern. Whenever compliance flagged an issue, the fix wasn't a fix. It was a reframing. If we said, "This needs review," they'd say, "We'll optimize later." If we said, "This may violate policy," they'd say, "We interpret policy dynamically." If we said, "This creates risk," they'd say, "Risk is a feature of growth." They didn't argue with facts. They edited language until the facts sounded optional. And language is where big failures begin. Not with explosions, with synonyms. One Tuesday, a junior analyst on my team, Naomi, 26, brilliant, still new enough to care, knocked on my door. She looked nervous in the way smart people look nervous when they're about to tell the truth in a place that punishes it. "Claire," she said, "can you look at this?" She handed me a printed chart. It showed customer verification rates over the last quarter. At first glance, it looked good. Too good. There was a smooth upward curve. The kind executives love, because it looks like control. But Naomi had circled a section in red. "This doesn't match the raw logs," she whispered. Raw logs. The word made my mind sharpen. Raw logs don't flatter anyone. They just exist. I took the paper and told Naomi to pull the source data again, quietly. "Don't email it," I said. "Download it. Put it in the secure folder." Her eyes widened. Are we in trouble?" I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to scare her, because the first rule of staying alive in corporate warfare is simple. Don't name the danger too early. Once you name it, they can accuse you of imagining it. That afternoon, I stayed late. The office emptied in layers, interns first, then managers, then executives who believed leaving after dark proved dedication. At 9:18 p.m., the building was quiet enough to hear the vents breathing. I opened the verification dashboard Naomi referenced. It was a sleek interface, bright charts, friendly colors, designed to make risk look like a game you could win. I clicked through settings, filters, segments, exclusions. Then I saw it. A toggle buried under Advanced Configuration, Default, On, Label, Temporary Bypass for Low-Risk Accounts. My finger hovered over the mouse. Temporary bypass. The words were soft, but the action behind them was sharp. I clicked. A window popped up with a date stamp. Activated 91 days ago. And below it, a note. Approved by G.S. Grant Sloan. My throat went tight. Not from shock, from clarity. This wasn't a mistake made by overworked teams. This was a choice made by someone with power. And it wasn't temporary. It was intentional. I didn't take a screenshot immediately. I paused. Because I knew what came next. If I captured it, I had responsibility. If I captured it, I became dangerous. And dangerous people in corporate buildings get managed, contained, removed. But I also knew something else. If I didn't capture it, then I was already participating. Silence is not neutral when you're standing near a lie. I took the screenshot. Then another. Then I exported the settings history. Then I downloaded the raw logs. I saved everything into a folder that wasn't on the company network. A secure folder I had created for audit preparation. A folder that, technically, I was allowed to maintain. Compliance needs evidence. That's what the policies say. And policies, when read correctly, can be weapons. Over the next week, I watched people more closely. Not in paranoia. In pattern recognition. Dan Mercer started checking in more often. He'd stop by my desk, ask how I was adjusting, and linger just long enough to make it feel like attention. But it wasn't attention. It was surveillance with a smile. During one check-in, he mentioned, casually, that the company was entering a pivotal season. There's a lot of visibility right now, he said. Visibility. Corporate code for don't embarrass us. Then he added, softer. We need leaders who can balance integrity with practicality. Balance. Corporate code for bend. I nodded and kept my face still. After he left, I opened my notes and typed one line. Dan is preparing the narrative. The following Friday, I attended an executive meeting as an observer. The agenda included M&A readiness. The CEO spoke about market opportunities. Grant Sloan spoke about valuation. The head of legal, Marissa Quill, spoke about regulatory posture. Marissa had a voice like polished stone. Smooth, cold, and heavy. When she spoke, people leaned back, as if the air itself had become formal. She presented a slide labeled, Compliance Confidence Package. Under it, bullet points about enhanced KYC protocols. It was the same language I would later see on the document they asked me to sign. So, the boardroom pen wasn't a sudden ask. It was the last step in a plan. I raised my hand. Not aggressively. Just professionally. Can you clarify, I said, whether verification improvements include any temporary bypasses currently enabled in the system? The room went still in a subtle way. Not silent. Just weighty. Grant turned his head toward me slowly, like someone turning toward a sound they didn't expect to hear. Marissa smiled, not warm, not friendly. A smile that existed to show she had control over her own face. Dan spoke first. Claire, he said, with a gentle laugh. We can take that offline. Take it offline. That phrase is the corporate version of a curtain closing. It means, this is not for public hearing. It means, you are disrupting the script. I looked around the table. The CEO avoided my eyes. Grant stared at me with the patience of someone watching a door they plan to lock. Marissa's smile didn't change. Then she said, calmly, our systems are configured appropriately for our risk profile. Appropriately. A word so flexible it can justify anything. I wanted to press. But pressing in a room full of people invested in denial is not bravery. It's volunteering to be isolated. So I did something smarter. I nodded. I wrote it down. And I listened. Because the best evidence isn't what they hide. It's what they say when they think you've accepted the lie. After the meeting, Marissa approached me near the elevators. Up close, she smelled like expensive perfume and certainty. Claire, she said, I heard you've been very diligent. The way she said diligent made it sound like an illness. I like diligence, she continued, as long as it's channeled correctly. Channeled. Corporate code for controlled. I kept my voice even. I'm doing my job. Marissa tilted her head slightly. Yes, she said. Just make sure your job doesn't become a distraction. Then she stepped into the elevator and disappeared behind closing doors. A distraction. That word followed me back to my office. A distraction to what? To growth. To valuation. To the story they were selling. That evening, I called my father. Not because I wanted advice about finance. Because my father was the kind of man who never lied to make life easier. He'd been a union electrician for 30 years. He'd taught me that a good system isn't a system that looks good. A good system is a system that holds under pressure. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, kid," he said. "You working late again?" I leaned against the window and watched the city lights flicker like distant signals. "Yeah," I said. He chuckled softly. "You're like your mom. She always stayed late when she was trying to fix something no one else wanted fixed." I swallowed. "She got punished for that," I said quietly. There was a pause on the line. Then, his voice changed deeper, slower. "Claire," he said, "some places don't punish mistakes. They punish honesty." I closed my eyes, because hearing it out loud made it real, in a way spreadsheets never could. "Then what do I do?" I asked. He didn't give me a speech. He gave me something better. A simple sentence. "Do what lets you sleep." That was all. Do what lets you sleep. Not what makes you rich. Not what makes you liked. Not what makes you safe for now. What lets you sleep. When I hung up, I opened my secure folder again and expanded it. Not because I planned to burn anyone down, because I could already feel the company preparing to burn me. The next Monday morning, Naomi brought me a fresh set of numbers. Her hands were steady, but her eyes weren't. "They changed the dashboard," she said. I scanned the screen. The toggle was still there, but the label was different. Now it read, "Optimization setting for customer experience." They had renamed the lie. Because when you can't erase the behavior, you polish the wording. I looked at Naomi. "Did anyone ask you about this?" I said. She hesitated, then nodded. "A guy from finance," she whispered. "He asked why I was pulling raw logs." My pulse didn't spike. It settled. Like a lock clicking into place. They were watching. Which meant they were worried. I told Naomi to take the rest of the day off. "Go home," I said. "Turn off your work apps. Don't talk about this with anyone." She stared at me like she didn't want to obey. Like she wanted to stay and fight. But fighting isn't always loud. Sometimes, fighting is moving the pieces quietly before the other side realizes the board exists. When she left, I did two things. First, I drafted a compliance memo. Not an accusation, a question. A formal request for clarification on system settings and risk classification. Second, I scheduled a meeting not with Dan, not with Grant, with internal audit, a department most executives pretend to respect until it becomes inconvenient. The meeting invite sat on my calendar like a small grenade. Tuesday, 10 a.m. Subject: Verification Controls Review. I didn't send it to the executive team. Not yet. I wanted the audit team to see the raw truth before anyone had time to dress it up. At 9:47 a.m. the next day, Dan called me into his office. He didn't look angry. He looked prepared. There was a folder on his desk. And two coffees. One for him. One for me. An attempt at warmth. "Claire," he said, gesturing to the chair. "Sit." I sat. He leaned forward, hands clasped, voice gentle. "I heard you scheduled time with internal audit." I didn't flinch. "I did," I said. He nodded slowly, like he was disappointed in a child. "That wasn't necessary." Necessary. In this building, necessary meant approved by power. "I'm seeing something in the system," I said evenly. "I want it reviewed properly." Dan Sahil. "Claire," he said. "We're in a sensitive season." Sensitive. Corporate Code 4. "You can't tell the truth right now." He continued. "There's an acquisition on the table. People's jobs depend on this." People's jobs. A classic weapon. Turn the victim into the villain by making the truth look selfish. I looked at Dan and realized something that made me colder. He wasn't trying to understand. He was trying to manage. Then he said the sentence that confirmed everything. "Grant and Marissa are concerned that you're not aligned." Not aligned. The word that means, we can't control you. I leaned back slightly, kept my voice calm. "Dan," I said. "I'm aligned with policy." Dan's face tightened just for a moment. Then, he softened again. "We're not asking you to compromise," he said. He paused, choosing words like a surgeon choosing where to cut. "We're asking you to be strategic." Strategic. That was the door they wanted me to walk through. Be strategic. Translate. Wait. Be quiet. Let it happen. I looked at the coffee on his desk. Untouched. A prop. Then I looked at Dan. And I asked him a question I already knew the answer to. "Did you know the bypass was enabled?" Dan didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked downward for a fraction of a second. A small betrayal of the face. Then he met my gaze again. "Claire," he said softly, "don't corner me. Don't corner me. Not. No. Not. I didn't know. Just, don't corner me." That was his confession. Because innocent people don't fear corners. They fear lies. I stood up. "I'm keeping the audit meeting," I said. Dan's voice sharpened, still polite, but with steel underneath. "If you proceed," he said, "you may force decisions that won't be good for your future here." There it was. Not a threat. A forecast. A calm prediction of punishment. I nodded once. Then I walked out. And as I returned to my desk, I understood the shape of the war I was in. It wasn't a war of shouting. It was a war of paper and perception. A war where the first person to look difficult loses. So I decided then, I would not be difficult. I would be undeniable. At 10 a.m., internal audit joined the call. Two faces on screen. One skeptical. One curious. I shared my screen. I showed them the toggle. I showed them the activation date. I showed them the raw logs. I showed them the renamed label. And then I did the most powerful thing you can do, in a room full of people who want comfort. I stopped talking. I let the evidence speak. The lead auditor's eyebrows lifted slowly. "Who approved this?" he asked. I didn't guess. I didn't imply. I pointed. "Approved by G.S." Silence. The kind of silence that means something just shifted. Not emotionally. Structurally. When the call ended, I didn't feel victorious. I felt exposed. Because now the truth wasn't just mine. It belonged to a process. And processes in corporations are like rivers. Once they start moving, people upstream panic. At 12:13 p.m., my phone buzzed with a message from Dan. "Can you come by?" I didn't respond. I didn't refuse. I simply waited. Because I knew what came next. In places like Arbor and Vale, when you tell the truth through the right channel, the retaliation doesn't arrive with fists. It arrives with meetings. With concern. With HR. With words designed to make you doubt your own clarity. And while the office moved around me, keyboards clicking, printers humming, laughter floating from the break room, I sat at my desk and opened my secure folder. I created a new subfolder. I named it A Transition. Not because I planned to leave. Because I was smart enough to know they were already planning to remove me. I saved the audit meeting notes. I saved the email headers. I saved the version history. And then I stared at the neon sign in the lobby through the glass wall. Build trust at scale. I finally understood what it really meant. They weren't building trust. They were building the appearance of it. And if I stayed, I would either become part of that appearance, or I would become the reason it cracked. I stood up, straightened my blazer, and walked toward Dan's office. Not with fear. With precision. Because I knew the next stage of the story wasn't going to be about whether I was right. It was going to be about whether I could survive being right. The first thing they took wasn't my job. It was my access. The morning after the audit meeting, my badge still opened the door, but my dashboard didn't load. Instead, a neutral gray screen appeared with a single sentence. "Permission restricted. Contact your administrator." I stared at it longer than necessary. Because in companies like Arbor and Vale, permission isn't technical. It's political. I refreshed. Same message. I opened my email. 3 unread messages. One from IT. One from HR. One from Dan. The IT email was short. Temporary access adjustment, following system review. Temporary. That word again. Temporary is how they stall you while they move around you. HR's message was longer. "Hi, Claire. We'd like to schedule a check-in to discuss how you're feeling and ensure you have the support you need during this transitional period." Transitional. I hadn't resigned. I hadn't been fired. But they were already writing me into the past tense. Dan's message came last. "Let's talk. This doesn't need to escalate." Escalate. As if the truth had climbed somewhere it wasn't invited. I closed my laptop and sat still. Because reacting too fast is how they frame you as unstable. And unstable people don't get believed. At no otrajzacham, Naomi texted me. "Are you okay?" Just that. No emojis. No filler. I typed back slowly. "I'm fine. Are you?" There was a pause. Then, they moved me to another project. Another project. The corporate version of exile. They didn't fire Naomi. They removed her from proximity. Because witnesses are only dangerous when they're close enough to see. I told her to document everything. I told her not to argue. I told her something I'd learned too late in my own career. When people start acting strange, it means you were right. She didn't reply. Which told me everything. At 10 a.m., I walked into HR. The room was the same beige as always. Same bowl of candy. Same poster about psychological safety. A woman named Ellen sat across from me. She smiled with the careful neutrality of someone trained to listen without absorbing. "Claire," she said gently. "We just want to check in." Check in. As if I'd been injured by my own integrity. She folded her hands. "There's been some concern about your approach." Approach? I waited. She continued. "Some leaders feel your communication style has been rigid." Rigid. That word landed exactly where they intended. Not unethical. Not incorrect. Rigid. A flaw of temperament. Not substance. I leaned back. "Rigid how?" I asked. Ellen hesitated. Then she read from her notes. Unwillingness to collaborate. Escalating matters prematurely. Creating anxiety. Creating anxiety. I almost smiled. Because anxiety is what happens when lies are exposed to air. I kept my voice even. "I followed protocol," I said. "I raised a compliance concern to internal audit." Ellen nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "But timing matters." Timing. The invisible leash. She leaned forward slightly. "Claire," she said, lowering her voice. "Sometimes doing the right thing isn't about being right. It's about knowing when to be right." That sentence sounded wise. It wasn't. It was obedience dressed up as maturity. I asked one question. "Is my job at risk?" Ellen's smile tightened. "We're just exploring alignment." Alignment again. Always alignment. They never say, "We want silence." They say, "We want harmony." I stood up. "If there are performance concerns," I said, "I'd like them documented." Ellen blinked. That wasn't part of the script. "We're not there yet," she said quickly. "Not yet." Meaning, we're getting there. I walked out. Not angry. Focused. Because I knew the next move wouldn't come from HR. It would come from someone I trusted. At 11:47 a.m., Dan asked me to join him for lunch. Off-site. A quiet place. "Just to talk," he said. I agreed. Not because I trusted him. Because I needed to hear how far he was willing to go. The restaurant was calm. White tablecloths. Muted conversations. A place designed for deals that pretend to be friendships. Dan ordered for both of us. Another small control. He waited until the food arrived before speaking. "Claire," he said, "you've put me in a difficult position." There it was. Not, "I'm worried about you." Not, "Let's fix this." "You've put me in a difficult position," he continued. Grant and Marissa feel blindsided. Blindsided. As if the audit meeting had jumped out from behind a wall. They're questioning whether you can operate at the executive level. Executive level. Meaning. Will you protect power when power asks? I took a sip of water. "Did you know about the bypass?" I asked quietly. Dan didn't answer. He stared at his plate. Then he said, "That's not the point." That was the moment. The moment the mask slipped. Because when someone says, "That's not the point," they're admitting you've touched the truth, and they want you to move your hand. "I thought we were aligned," he said. Aligned. I set my glass down carefully. "We are," I said. "With policy." Dan exhaled, frustrated now. "You're being idealistic," he said. "This is how companies grow." I looked at him. Really, looked. And I realized something that hurt more than any threat. Dan wasn't evil. He was afraid. Afraid of losing proximity to power. Afraid of becoming irrelevant. Afraid of being replaced by someone quieter and more obedient. And fear, when it wears a suit, can do extraordinary damage. He leaned in. "Claire," he said, lowering his voice. "If you back off now, this can still work. Back off. Step aside. Disappear gently. We can reposition you," he continued. "Give you a strategic role. Less exposure. Exposure. Truth is exposure to people who benefit from darkness." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "Just that." Dan's jaw tightened. "Then you're forcing our hand." There it was. The line that turns conversation into consequence. When lunch ended, Dan didn't offer to walk me out. He paid. Another small control. Back at the office, my calendar had changed. Meetings removed. Invites canceled. I'd been erased from the flow of decisions. At 3:12 p.m., I received an email. Subject: Interim coverage. They were assigning an interim compliance lead. A man named Lucas Reed, former consultant, smiled in his profile photo like he'd never said no to anyone important. Lucas scheduled a handover meeting. Tomorrow morning. They weren't waiting. That night, I didn't go home. I went to my condo, grabbed a bag, and drove to my father's place in the suburbs. Not for comfort. For clarity. I sat at his kitchen table while he made coffee. The same table where he'd once helped me study for my first compliance exam. I told him everything. Not emotionally, chronologically. Because stories make sense when you tell them in order. He listened without interrupting. Then he said something that stayed with me. "They're not trying to beat you," he said. "They're trying to tire you." That was it. This wasn't about one signature. It was about exhaustion. About making resistance feel heavier than surrender. I slept that night without dreams. The next morning, I logged in remotely. My access was further reduced. But not eliminated. They never shut the door completely. Because they want you to leave quietly. At 9 a.m., the handover meeting began. Lucas smiled warmly. "Claire," he said, "I'm excited to learn from you." Learn. As if this were voluntary. I shared my screen. But not the way they expected. I didn't walk him through processes. I walked him through history. Dates. Changes. Renamed labels. Approval trails. I spoke calmly. Professionally. Lucas nodded. Then he said, "This seems interpretive." Interpretive. A consultant's favorite word. "Perhaps," I said. "But regulators don't interpret timestamps." The call ended awkwardly. Good. Awkward means something didn't fit the script. That afternoon, Marissa called me directly. Her voice was cool. Controlled. "Claire," she said, "you're putting the company at risk." I almost laughed. "No," I said. "I'm documenting risk." There was a pause. Then her tone changed. Sharper. "Be careful," she said. "Whistleblower narratives can backfire." There it was. The threat. Finally spoken. Not explicit. But clear. I ended the call. And then I did the thing they underestimated. I stopped playing defense. I organized my evidence. Not emotionally. Legally. I mapped every decision. Every approver. Every language shift. I built a timeline, so clean it could stand alone without me. Because the most dangerous evidence isn't angry. It's boring. At 6:48 p.m., I received the email. Subject: Role transition. They were placing me on administrative leave. Effective immediately. They framed it as support. Time to reflect. Time to rest. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it with headers to my personal archive. And I smiled. Because administrative leave is a confession. It means they're scared of what you might say next. They thought removing me would end the story. They didn't realize the story no longer needed me in the building. It just needed time. And they had already given it that. Administrative leave sounds gentle. Like a pause. Like a reset. In reality, it's a muzzle with polite stitching. They didn't lock me out because they thought I was wrong. They locked me out because they knew I was right, and they needed time to rewrite the room around that fact. The first day off, I woke up at 5:40 a.m. Out of habit. No commute. No badge. No neon sign pretending trust could be manufactured. Just my kitchen, quiet and clean, and the lake outside my windows looking honest. I made coffee and opened my personal laptop. Not to obsess. To organize. Because retaliation is easier to survive when you treat it like an audit. I created a spreadsheet. One column for dates. One for decisions. One for approvals. One for language changes. One for supporting evidence. The last column was the most important. Who benefits? By 7:12 a.m., I'd built a timeline that looked like a staircase. A gradual climb of small choices. Small choices that led to a cliff. At 8:03 a.m., Dan called. I let it ring. Then I answered calmly. Like his voice didn't have the power to shift my heartbeat. "Claire," he said. "I want to make sure you're okay." "Okay?" As if my well-being was the issue. I'm fine, I said. He exhaled. Listen, the admin leave is temporary. It's just to keep things stable. Stable. Meaning, quiet. You can come back, he added. If you're willing to recalibrate. Recalibrate. That was their favorite kind of word. A word that sounds technical but means moral surrender. I'm not recalibrating truth, I said. Silence. Then his tone changed, just slightly. Claire, he said. Grant thinks you're building a case. Grant thinks. So they were watching shadows and calling them threats. I'm documenting, I said. Same thing, Dan replied. He didn't say it like a joke. He said it like a warning. When I hung up, my phone buzzed again. A new email from Arbor and Vale. Subject: Equipment return. They wanted my laptop back. Immediately. They weren't asking for technology, they were asking for access to whatever I might have taken. But I hadn't taken company data. Not illegally. I'd taken what compliance is allowed to maintain. Audit preparation notes. Process documentation. Evidence of controls and control failures. All within policy. All defensible. They could demand my laptop. They couldn't demand my memory. And they couldn't erase the headers I had already forwarded to myself. At 10:22 a.m., I got a LinkedIn notification. Arbor and Vale had posted a leadership update. Please welcome Lucas Reed as interim head of compliance. Smiling photo. Warm caption. Congratulations, flooding the comments like confetti at a funeral. I stared at the post. Then I clicked Lucas's profile. He'd updated his headline already. Driving trust at scale. Of course. At noon, Naomi called. Her voice was low. They're asking questions, she whispered. About you. What kind of questions? I asked. Whether you were unstable, she said. Unstable. There it was. The oldest corporate weapon, aimed at a woman who refuses to play nice. They asked if you were emotional, Naomi continued. If you had personal issues. If you were overwhelmed. I closed my eyes. Because it wasn't new. It was predictable. When they can't disprove your evidence, they attack your identity. I kept my voice steady. Naomi, I said, do you still have access to the raw logs? A pause, then, quietly, yes. Don't pull anything new, I said. Don't email anything, don't argue, just keep your head down. What are you doing? She asked. I looked at the spreadsheet. At the dates. At the approvals. At the staircase leading to the cliff. I'm letting them finish, I said. And in the silence on the other end, I could feel her trying to understand. Because most people think payback means throwing a punch. They don't understand. The most devastating payback is letting someone sign their own downfall. 2 days later, the first crack appeared. A friend in product, someone I'd helped quietly during a compliance review months ago, texted me from a burner number. Don't reply, they're rushing a new feature. A new feature. In a company under audit pressure. I stared at the message. Then my phone buzzed again. Second text. They're calling it frictionless onboarding. Frictionless. Translation: fewer checks. I opened my timeline and added a new row. Feature push during scrutiny. Who benefits? Grant. Valuation. Speed. They were doubling down. And doubling down is what people do when they're terrified of slowing down long enough to face themselves. That afternoon, I received an email from internal audit. It wasn't a report. It wasn't a conclusion. It was a question. Claire, can you clarify whether the bypass was still active as of the date of your meeting? I read it carefully. Then I wrote back with the only thing they couldn't argue with. I attached the screenshot. I attached the export. I attached the settings history. Time-stamped. I didn't add adjectives. No anger. No accusation. Just documentation. When I hit send, I didn't feel relief. I felt the air shift. Because now the evidence wasn't personal. It was procedural. And procedures are hard to bury without leaving fingerprints. The next morning, my former colleague in product sent one more message. They're telling everyone the bypass never existed. Never existed. That was bold. That was desperate. That was the kind of lie that collapses under the weight of a single screenshot. At 9:11 a.m., my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered. A man's voice. Professional. Measured. Miss Hart, he said. My name is Thomas Keene. I'm counsel representing an external party conducting due diligence related to Arbor and Vale. External party. Due diligence. Acquisition. They were still chasing the deal. Even with smoke in the hallway. I have a few questions, he said. Do you have time? I looked at the lake outside my window. Then at my spreadsheet. Yes, I said. He began with the kind of polite questions that pretend to be harmless. Can you describe your role? Were there any control concerns? Did you raise them internally? I answered simply, chronologically. Then he asked the question that told me the deal was already bleeding. Did executive leadership ever ask you to sign any attestation related to verification improvements? The boardroom pen. The alibi. I paused for half a second. Just enough for the weight of it to exist. Yes, I said. They did. And did you sign? He asked. No, I said. Another pause. Then his voice lowered slightly. Did they retaliate? Retaliate. A word lawyers don't use casually. I kept my tone calm. They placed me on administrative leave after I presented evidence to internal audit, I said. He didn't respond with sympathy. He responded with process. Do you have documentation? He asked. I do, I said. Can you provide it? He asked. There it was. The moment most people dream of when they fantasize about revenge. A chance to burn everything down in one email. I didn't rush. Because rushing creates mistakes. And mistakes are what they want. I can provide what I'm legally permitted to share, I said. He agreed. We scheduled a follow-up through official channels. When the call ended, I sat in silence. Not triumphant. Just certain. Because they weren't just being audited now. They were being examined by someone with money on the line. And money does not tolerate temporary bypasses. That evening, Dan emailed me again. Subject. Confidential. 2 words. Short. Threatening in their softness. Claire, the email began. We heard you've been speaking with external parties. We heard. Meaning. They were tracking. Meaning. They were scared. This could expose you to legal risk, Dan wrote. We want to resolve this amicably. Amicably. The word people use right before they try to crush you politely. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the email to my archive. Headers intact. Because every intimidation attempt is also evidence. At 6:03 a.m. the next day, the regulator's email arrived. I didn't see it in real time, but I heard about it 20 minutes later when Naomi called me. Breathless. They're panicking, she whispered. The CEO is screaming. Screaming. I almost didn't believe it. Because CEOs at Arbor and Vale didn't scream, they performed calm like it was a requirement in their contracts. What happened? I asked. Naomi swallowed. The regulator sent a formal inquiry, she said. Customer verification practices. They referenced internal settings. Internal settings. They already knew. Someone had connected the dots. Internal audit. Due diligence counsel. Or a whistleblower line. It didn't matter. The truth had entered the building through a door they couldn't lock. Naomi continued. Grant is blaming you. Of course. How? I asked. He told people you planted it, she said. That you sabotaged the system. I laughed a short, involuntary sound. Because sabotage is what people accuse you of when your evidence is too clean to deny. Naomi, I said gently. Do you remember the approval stamp? G.S., she whispered. Yes, I said. That's not sabotage. That's ownership. At 8:44 a.m., Lucas Reed held an emergency meeting. He told the compliance team everything was under control. He said the bypass was a legacy configuration. Legacy. A word that pretends yesterday's decisions don't belong to today's leaders. He promised a remediation plan. He promised transparency. And then someone in the meeting asked a question I later heard through a friend. If it was legacy, they asked, why was the label changed last week? Silence. Because that's the kind of detail that kills a lie. Labels don't change themselves. People change labels when they're trying to hide what the label means. By noon, the Acquisition Council requested additional materials. By 2 p.m., the investors' team delayed the signing meeting. By 4:17 p.m., Arbor and Vale's board scheduled an emergency session. And by 6:30 p.m., Grant Sloan stopped answering calls. He wasn't in meetings. He wasn't in Slack. He was gone in the way powerful people disappear when the story turns against them. That night, I received a message from an unknown number. A photo. A screenshot from inside the company. It was a calendar invite titled, Executive Review Compliance Incident. Attendees included the CEO, Marissa Quill, Dan Mercer, Lucas Reed, and one more name, Grant Sloan. Status, removed. They'd cut him loose. Not because they suddenly grew ethics, because scapegoats are cheaper than accountability. 2 days later, Arbor and Vale sent me a letter. Not an apology. Not a reinstatement. A proposed resolution. Severance. Non-disclosure. Non-disparagement. And a new clause. Agreement not to contact regulators or external parties. They were still trying to buy silence, even while the building was on fire. I stared at the letter. Then I opened my archive. I looked at the timeline again. And I realized the truth they didn't want to accept. They weren't negotiating with me anymore. They were negotiating with consequences. I called Thomas Keene back. The Acquisition Council. I received a resolution offer, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, carefully, does it include restrictions related to communication with regulators? It does, I said. His voice hardened in a subtle way. Thank you, he said. That's useful. Useful. In law, useful means deadly. The next week, the deal collapsed. Not with headlines. With silence. No celebratory announcement. No press release. Just a cancelled signing and a delayed filing. Arbor and Vale's leadership tried to pretend it was strategic. But inside, people knew. They could feel it in the hallway. In the way doors closed quickly. In the way conversations stopped when someone walked by. And then the board did what boards always do when they're cornered. They demanded names. They demanded accountability. They demanded a story that didn't implicate them. Dan called me again. This time, his voice wasn't smooth. It was thin. Claire, he said. We need to talk. Need. Not want. Need. About what? I asked. He swallowed. We might have made mistakes, he said. Mistakes. As if this was a typo. We'd like to bring you back, he added quickly. To stabilize things. Bring you back. Not because they respected me, because they needed me to clean the blood off the floor. I looked out at the lake again. The water didn't pretend to be calm. It just was. And that's the kind of calm you earn when you stop begging people to be honest. No, I said. Dan's voice cracked. Claire, please. Please. That word sounded foreign in his mouth. You fired me for telling the truth, I said quietly. Now you want me to protect you from it. Silence. Then, smaller, what do you want? What do you want? The question people ask when they realize they can't control you with fear. I didn't answer with a demand. I answered with a boundary. I want everything documented, I said. In writing. Because my revenge wasn't revenge. It was a record. A clean, quiet record. One that would outlive their excuses. And if they wanted me back in that building, they were going to sign something real for the first time. Not an alibi. A confession. By the time they asked me back, the building already felt haunted. Not by ghosts. By records. Every hallway at Arbor and Vale now carried a memory someone wished they could delete. I agreed to return for one meeting. One. On my terms. They scheduled it in the largest boardroom, glass walls. Skyline view. Polished table. Meant to reflect authority. When I arrived, security didn't greet me. They avoided my eyes. Because power had shifted, and no one had sent the memo yet. Inside the room sat the board. Not all of them. Just enough to claim legitimacy. The CEO was there, Dan. Marissa. Lucas sat near the end, hands folded, silent, already learning how fast loyalty evaporates. Grant's chair was empty. No nameplate. No explanation. Absence is how corporations erase people without admitting fault. The CEO stood as I entered. Claire, he said. Thank you for coming. Thank you. The phrase tasted strange in that room. I didn't sit. Not yet. You asked me back, I said calmly. Before we begin, I want one thing clear. The CEO nodded. Everything discussed today is documented, I continued. Notes, audio, timestamps. Marissa's jaw tightened. The CEO hesitated, then nodded again. Of course. Of course. People say that when they know, refusing would look like guilt. I sat. The CEO spoke first. Claire, We believe mistakes were made. Mistakes. Plural. Passive. No owner. We're reviewing processes, he continued. And we'd like your help restoring confidence. Restoring confidence. Not truth. Confidence. I folded my hands. Before we discuss restoration, I said, we need to discuss responsibility. The room cooled. Marissa leaned forward. Claire, she said, voice smooth. This is not a courtroom. I looked at her. No, I said. It's a record. Dan shifted in his chair. The CEO cleared his throat. Go on. I opened my folder. Not thick. Not dramatic. Just clean. I want to walk through the timeline, I said. And I want confirmation when I'm correct. Not permission. Confirmation, I began. On March 4th, the verification bypass was enabled under an advanced configuration setting. I paused. Approved by Grant Sloan. No one spoke. I continued. On May 17th, the label for that setting was changed from temporary bypass to optimization for customer experience. I looked at Marissa. Legal approved that language. Marissa didn't deny it. She said something worse. That was a semantics review, she said. Semantics. The art of hiding intent behind syllables. So you reviewed the language, I said. But not the behavior. Her lips pressed together. I kept going. On June 2nd, compliance raised a concern internally. I looked at Dan. You advised me to take it offline. Dan swallowed. I was trying to manage exposure, he said. Exposure. Truth framed as danger. On June 10th, I said. I presented evidence to internal audit. I turned to the board. Within 48 hours, my system access was restricted. I let that sit. On June 14th, I was placed on administrative leave. Silence. The CEO shifted. Lucas stared at the table. On June 21st, I continued. The company issued a leadership update naming an interim compliance head. I nodded toward Lucas. Without disclosing an active audit. Lucas finally spoke. I was told it was legacy, he said. Legacy. The lie that floats when no one wants to sink. I closed the folder. This is not a misunderstanding, I said. It's a sequence. The CEO leaned back, rubbing his temples. Claire, he said. What are you asking for? I met his eyes. I'm asking you to say, on record, who knew? Marissa laughed softly. Claire, she said. This isn't productive. Productive. A word people use when truth threatens outcomes. The CEO raised a hand. Marissa, he said quietly. She stopped. He looked at me. What happens if we don't? He asked. I answered honestly. Then this record goes where records go, I said. Regulators, counsel, discovery. I didn't threaten. I described gravity. Dan finally spoke again. We were under immense pressure, he said. The deal. I cut in. Pressure doesn't create bypasses, I said. People do. The CEO exhaled slowly. Grant acted independently, he said. There it was. The scapegoat. He's no longer with the company, the CEO continued. We're cooperating fully. I nodded. Grant approved the bypass, I said. Who instructed legal to reframe it? Marissa stiffened. I approved language, she said. I did not instruct implementation. Did you know the bypass was active? I asked. A pause. A long one. Then she said. Yes. The word landed like a dropped glass. And did you advise leadership to disclose it during due diligence? I asked. No. She said. Dan closed his eyes. The CEO's face went pale. I turned to him. And you, I said. When I refused to sign the attestation, why was it still circulated? He hesitated. Then, we believed alignment was possible. Alignment. Always alignment. You needed a signature, I said. Not alignment. The CEO didn't argue. He knew. Because, at some point, denial stops working. Here's what happens next, I said calmly. I will provide my documentation to the appropriate parties. I will not sign any agreement restricting communication with regulators. And if you want my help stabilizing compliance, I added, it will be under conditions that protect truth, not optics. Marissa leaned back, defeated. Dan looked older than I'd ever seen him. The CEO nodded slowly. What conditions? He asked. I slid a single page across the table. Not a contract. A list. Written acknowledgement of the bypass and its approval chain. Protection for any employee who raised concerns. Independent oversight. And my role, I said, reports directly to the board. Not management. The room was silent. Finally, the CEO spoke. We'll need to review this. I stood. You already did, I said. You're just deciding whether to admit it. I left the room without waiting for permission. Because permission is what they use to delay the inevitable. 2 days later, the board issued a memo. Carefully worded. But different. It acknowledged control failures. It referenced inappropriate configuration changes. It named no heroes, but it named the truth. Grant resigned for personal reasons. Marissa stepped down to pursue other opportunities. Dan was reassigned. No announcement. Just absence. The deal was officially terminated the following week. Arbor and Vale's valuation dropped. Quietly. Painfully. They asked me again to return. This time, the offer was clean. No muzzle. No silence clause. I declined. Not because I was angry. Because I was done. I accepted a role elsewhere. A smaller company. Less neon. More honesty. And when people asked why I left Arbor and Vale, I didn't tell a dramatic story. I said one sentence. They wanted my signature more than my judgment. That sentence traveled. Months later, I read an article about Arbor and Vale. New leadership. New messaging. Same promise. Build trust at scale. I closed the article and smiled. Because trust doesn't scale. It accumulates. And once broken, it doesn't come back because a board says so. It comes back when someone chooses truth over comfort. I didn't burn the company down. I let it stand in the light. And that was enough. A year later, my name wasn't attached to headlines. And that was exactly how I wanted it. People assume winning looks loud. They imagine apologies, public reversals, dramatic vindication. Real victories don't look like that. They look like distance. I took a role at a mid-sized company outside the spotlight. No neon slogans. No glass-walled temples to ambition. Just a quiet office, clear processes, and leaders who didn't flinch when compliance spoke. On my first day, the CEO asked me one question. What happens if you say no? It wasn't a test. It was a value check. If I say no, I replied, we slow down. He nodded. Good, he said. That's the cost of building something that lasts. That's how I knew I'd chosen correctly. Arbor and Vale didn't disappear. Companies like that rarely do. They shed skin. New executives. New decks. New language. But the story never fully resets. People remember. Quietly. Months after the deal collapsed, I received a message from a former board member. Short. Careful. Your documentation changed how we think about risk. That was all. No apology. No regret. Just acknowledgement. And in places like corporate America, acknowledgement is rare currency. Naomi moved on too. She joined a firm that didn't exile curiosity. She sent me a photo of her new desk. A sticky note on the monitor read, "Document everything." I smiled when I saw it. Because that's how cultures really change. Not through speeches. Through habits passed hand to hand. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not taking the severance. The money. The silence. I tell them no. Because I've learned something most people don't learn until it's too late. The most expensive thing you can sell is your credibility. Once it's gone, no payout buys it back. At night, I sleep without replaying conversations. Without rehearsing alternate endings. Because I didn't trade tomorrow for comfort today. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't destroy anyone. I just refused to become useful to a lie. And that's what ended it. Not rage. Not revenge. Refusal. The companies that fail aren't always the ones with bad people. They're the ones that teach good people to stay quiet. I didn't stay quiet. I stayed precise. And precision lasts longer than fear ever does.